Welcome to Principles of Macroeconomics. My name is Jeremy Chiquette, and I am your instructor for the semester. So, without any further ado, we can just get started. So, what is the point of macroeconomics? Like, why do we care? Really, I guess that's what we're going to be talking about throughout the whole course. So, there's no real good answer to give you right now, aside from we care because we want to get a good grade in the class, presumably. But really, we want to learn about how the whole economy operates, right? So the entire United States economy. We want to know about how that's going to work. In microeconomics, you learn about how individual firms, individual markets, and households will all sort of interact, right? So you learn how price and quantity respond to changes in equilibrium, where demand and supply are equal to each other. If there's a change in the price, there's a change in the quantity exogenously or from outside the system, what happens to the equilibrium? How does demand change? How does supply change? Things like that. You also learned about how market forces tried to reach some equilibrium, right? How arbitrage would lead us to an equilibrium of sorts. Namely, if you obviously don't want to pay any more than you have to for any product, so you're going to always try to pay the lowest possible price. A firm's going to try to charge you the highest possible price. Well, as there's some back and forth, and you sort of haggle and find a price. Well, this market that we have is converging to an equilibrium. So you learn kind of how that worked. You learned how taxes and subsidies from the government would help the market reach some equilibrium that might not have been attainable in the absence of any intervention. Namely, say maybe the market's operating, but it's not operating as efficiently as it could be. Sometimes you need to have this third party come in, and by intervening in the market, they can actually improve the efficiency of the market. They can improve the overall welfare of the society by intervening in the markets and changing things just a little bit. Now, you also probably learned how markets sometimes didn't work the way that they should, and how there can be unintended third-party consequences. And presumably, if you're learning things like that, you're probably also learning different market structures: perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, monopoly. And if your teachers really hated you, maybe you even got a little bit of game theory and you learned something like the prisoner's dilemma. In macro, fortunately enough for everybody, it's really not all that different. You still learn how price and quantity respond to changes in equilibrium. You still learn how governments can come in and mess things up a little bit. But the thing is, it's all aggregated up to an entire economy. So you learn at the individual level how things operate in micro. In macro, you also kind of get that, but once you get that, you aggregate it up. So instead of how an individual market operates, instead it's how an entire country operates, or maybe a little bit lower level, it could be how an entire sector operates, or maybe even how a state would operate. You can also look at it globally. It's how the entire world would operate, right? There are different lenses that we can view macroeconomics through. Now, in micro, you also learned about how labor markets would work and how the wage rate could determine how much labor firms wanted to hire. You get the same in macro, it's just aggregated to the whole economy. And then you also learned about prices, inflation, which is the rate of change of prices. We'll get to that in the next two chapters. You'll learn about money, monetary policy, and of course, how governments love to screw things up. They're very, very good at that. So, as we go further in this lecture and throughout the course, we're going to be learning about how economics is really a science. And well, how is it a science? Because you're probably thinking, oh, you work in a lab and you got those fancy little beakers, and you're mixing stuff, and you wear those the smock or whatever the hell it is. I don't even remember. I haven't taken chemistry in almost 20 years at this point. But you get the goggles. You're like, let's crank this up a notch and see what we can do. Maybe that's what you're thinking, right? But it's a little bit goes beyond that, right? Because, well, we're asking questions. Of course, it doesn't mean that if you ever ask a question that you're automatically a scientist. But we figure out how to answer them. We collect data. We use a lot of math and statistics to analyze the data. We look at relationships between these different variables. We form hypotheses about these. and we come to a conclusion about how these variables interact. And then, of course, we have to be able to replicate our results for other people to look at our studies. Now, when it comes to science, of course, you get really two types of people. You get the people that actually bust their ass on this stuff and work really hard, and then you get the cheerleaders for science. Everybody knows who the cheerleaders are, but the thing is, these cheerleaders never really publish. So I'm going to pick on Neil deGrasse Tyson for a second. Seems like a really nice guy, actually, super smart. But instead of publishing, in which case his entire career would operate under relative obscurity, he sort of went a different route and kind of went the more public facing route, which again isn't bad. And if you don't know who he is, he's this guy right here. Isn't necessarily a bad thing, but he's not really on the leading edge of the research. And if he ever claims to be, what's really going on is he's actually just taking some of the findings from other researchers who maybe he knows very well and kind of just discusses what their findings are with the rest of the world. Now, it's not really a bad thing what he's doing. It's just he's not really a scientist, right? He's more of like a PR spokesman for science. Just like this guy. Remember, you got to listen to the science, okay, guys? You got to listen to the science. This is another guy, right? Always goes on about the science. Got to listen to the science. But look at what he's done. He really hasn't done very much, right? His publications are pretty thin. And whenever he was doing all his little PR stunts on TV, and you listen to what the guy said, he rarely ever really cited that much data, kind of took things from the gut. And, there comes a point in your career where you learn things well enough that you sort of internalize and you go, okay, well, it's probably going to be this, or this. But it seemed to go a little bit beyond that, right? This is another, what I would say, cheerleader for the science, because while other people are really working really, really hard to try to get answers to, in this case, very large questions, very important questions that the public had, this guy was really just kind of a mouthpiece for them, right? He sort of takes everything that they say and aggregates it all together and then just kind of becomes the mouthpiece for them. But they're not actually the scientists, right? And when it comes to that, well, this is one of the little comic things that I just adore, because this gets the point of what I'm trying to make across probably more eloquently than I was able to get it across in the last 4 minutes or however long it took for me to go on this stuff. But kind of looking at the end results, the big, super interesting stuff that comes at the end of the entire process doesn't really make you a scientist, nor does it make you enjoy science. It just means you like cool, big, flashy facts, as this says, right? To be a scientist, right, to get into this stuff, you got to go really, really deep. And, you got to do the boring stuff, and you got to go through the whole process beginning to end. You don't just get to sort of take these cool results at the end and then, share that with your friends. And, I guess in the case of Neil deGrasse Tyson or Anthony Fauci, you just kind of, share it with whoever's going to listen on TV. You need to do more than that. So anyways, let's kind of go on from that. Economics is, in fact, a science. And unfortunately, it's not always considered that way by people who don't really understand economics all that well. Who am I going to pick on next? Well, I'm going to pick on politicians next, because they love to talk about economics. You got our Liz Warrens, our Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, our Bernie Sanders. And in case you're like, oh, he's just picking on Democrats, well, I'm going to pick on some Republicans too. Rand Paul loves to do it. Ted Cruz likes to do it. And then whatever that mess is at the bottom, Joe Biden, you don't even know what he's doing anymore. He likes to do it too. But the thing is, they don't really have any clue what they're talking about because they don't understand the science behind it. Economics is an incredibly difficult, very rigorous discipline. It's not something you just get to go, oh, I'm going to look at demand and supply, and then I know about economics now. It goes deeper than that. And a lot of times what you see here is people trying to use this as a tool to get their own policy preferences implemented, and they're not necessarily in the pursuit of truth. So I'll get down from my soapbox a little bit here, and I'm going to talk about some actual economics for a change. Now, I'm going to discuss these 3 stages of economics, and I will freely admit I stole this from Daron Acemoglu's textbook. He called them the 3 principles of economics. If I change what the name is, then obviously all of a sudden it becomes different. So these 3 stages are, first, optimization. What happens here? Well, people optimize. They make the best choices possible given the constraints that they face, right? You face a budget constraint. Based on your budget constraint, you need to figure out how you want to spend your money. What is the best way for you to spend your money that maximizes your utility or your happiness, right? You face other constraints, though. You face time constraints. You only have 24 hours in a day. Now, a good chunk of that needs to be devoted to sleep. So let's say 8 hours of that goes to sleep, right? That doesn't really leave you a whole lot of time left. That's 16 hours. Well, if you work full time, that's at least 8 hours of your day that is now devoted to work. So that gives you 8 hours to really do the things that you want to do. But okay, well, you got to eat. You have to do basic things like, brush your teeth, shower. If, you're married and have kids, you've got to do stuff with your kids. You have to do things like, with your family. It doesn't really leave you a whole lot of time to yourself to do the things that you really want to do just for you. So you face constraints in ways that aren't just with your money. But we optimize. We make the best possible choices that we can. And in terms of, we'll think of this in terms of budget constraints here. When we optimize, we make the best choices we can, so we get the most bang for our buck, basically. Now, for households, that means that we are forming a demand curve. We will want these certain goods and services based on what we can afford and what our preferences are. Now, firms also optimize, right? That's the supply side of the economy. Firms will figure out what is the cost minimizing or profit maximizing quantity to produce for the market. Now, these decisions, the demand and supply decisions, are made simultaneously. Now, once everybody's optimized, what happens is we go to the market and then the exchange happens. People will buy companies' products and you have an exchange of resources, right? You can think of it in terms of money. If I've got $100, I go to the market and I spend $100. Well, that $100 leaves my hands, goes into somebody else's hands, and I get something back that I presumably will think is worth the $100 that I spent. So steps 1 and 2 are really how the market's operating and how the different components of the market will interact and communicate with each other in order for resources to change hands. But as economists, we really want to know how these 2 things are operating. So the 3rd stage is empirical analysis. This is where the economist comes in and really studies the first 2 stages to see how they work. And then if they find anything particularly interesting, they write a paper on it, they publish it. Nobody ever reads it, except like 5 people. And then their career ends up in, relative obscurity. It's kind of sad. Or, if they get really lucky, a lot of people read it. It's super awesome, and they end up getting the Nobel Prize in economics. You generally get something that's a little bit in between. Now, we want an outcome that is what's known as Pareto efficient, where no one person in this model can be made any better off without somebody else being made worse off. So that's kind of the paradigm that we're aiming for, right? The little pursuit of perfection, so to speak. Rarely will we ever get there in the real world, but it's a nice goal to try to aim for when it comes to the modeling process. And then, of course, if we aim for that, that's the best possible case scenario. Well, we're probably not going to get there in the real world. How is the real world market affecting things such that we can't get to this like heavenly perfection that we want? It's another case or another situation where the economist comes in, and in learning that, we can hopefully learn how to try to improve the efficiency of the market to make everybody better off. Now, when it comes to these 3 stages, the best way to think of this is kind of like we're watching a movie, right? How so? Well, characters, like every movie needs some core elements. The first one would be characters. Good, well-written characters that we care about, right? You need a protagonist. You need somebody that the movie is about that you're following, whether it's one person or 10 people. Doesn't really matter. We need to have somebody that we care about, somebody that we are attaching our emotional investment into, such that we have concern for them. We care about what happens throughout the movie. But having a good character isn't enough, right? You need a plot. You need a compelling story that puts these well-written characters through some kind of adversity where these characters have to interact, and then that causes them to grow as people. These two things here are really optimization and equilibrium. The characterization you can kind of think is the optimization part. The plot would kind of be the equilibrium. But now we need one final thing. Critics. Okay, maybe we're giving them a little too much credit here. They haven't exactly been very good in recent years. This guy's not bad, I guess, but a lot of the others are pretty bad. So what makes a movie good? Well, I saw 2 movies this past spring that are excellent examples of what does and doesn't work. And the first one is Nefarious, and the second one is The Pope's Exorcist. One was very, very good, and the other, not so much. So what made one better than the other? Well, if you are unaware of either of these movies, they both involve demonic possession. I know I'm a big horror movie junkie. And they approach it in very different ways. Nefarious is really a pretty quiet movie. There's ultimately really just 2 people in the movie. There's a couple other side characters, but the vast majority of the movie is just 2 people. There's a psychiatrist who gets called into a prison to interview a man who is set for execution later that day, and he needs to make sure that the guy isn't insane, because if he's insane, obviously the state wouldn't be able to execute him. So he needs to be able to make the judgment about whether this guy is sane and thus able to stand for his execution, or if he's insane and then thus will be removed from death row and probably go to some kind of a mental asylum. But when he gets there, he starts talking to this prisoner who's telling him that he's possessed by a demon. And so he has conversations with this guy, and the psychiatrist, of course, thinks that there's some kind of multiple personality thing going on, and that this guy isn't in fact possessed by a demon, that he's just, got some serious emotional trauma. But then there are some things that kind of unfold throughout the movie that kind of make you wonder, well, is it really some kind of demonic possession? Like, is there actually something going on with this guy? It's very quiet, very subtle. I don't think there's any like CGI, any computer effects. There's no action, nothing. It's all a mind game. It's entirely in your head, and the suspense builds very slowly throughout the movie. And as the movie develops, you begin to really care about what happens to these characters. And I don't want to spoil anything in case you haven't seen the movie, because it's really, really good. But then there's this movie, The Pope's Exorcist. I saw it literally the next day after I saw Nefarious in theaters. And while I remember everything about Nefarious, I really don't remember very much about this. I remember there's this kid who gets possessed. I don't even remember if it's a boy or a girl, by some demon, and then this guy Russell Crowe has to come in. He's like an exorcist for the Vatican. He's got to come in and try to like exorcise the demon from this kid. And then it turns out they're on like some like old burial ground. I think it had something to do with like the Knights Templar. But there's a lot of action. There's a lot of explosions, and the possessed kid throwing people across the room. There's no question about whether this kid is possessed, right? There's nothing really going on in your mind that's making you wonder, hey, what, is what I'm seeing what I'm actually seeing? Is, this kind of, could this be explained away by, rational things? Could science really explain a lot of this stuff? Is it just the kid has, some deep emotional trauma, or is there something more, right? There's none of that going on. It's blatantly obvious what's happening. I think heads spin around at some point. There's probably vomiting of split pea soup, like, in The Exorcist. It's all stuff we've seen before, and it's just not really that engaging. It's fun at times to watch, and by the end, you kind of go like, well, I'd sort of like to get my money back, but it wasn't the worst waste of my time, I guess. But obviously one is a little bit better than the others, right? Nefarious had good characters. It had a compelling story, and it left you with some really interesting questions at the end. Was he actually possessed, Or was this guy just crazy? And did he manipulate the psychiatrist such to the point that the psychiatrist started going crazy towards the end? Right? It didn't insult your intelligence if you're watching it, because it really respects the intelligence of the viewer to allow the viewer to kind of make up their own mind about what's happening. Meanwhile, this other film, characters weren't really all that interesting. The story was cliche. There's really nothing to ponder after it ended except, why did you waste $40 at the movie theater? And at least for me, I felt like it kind of just insulted my intelligence. I wasn't really that impressed with the movie walking out of it. So, one of these is quiet and thoughtful and gave us time to get to know the characters, let us bond with them, to give us some skin in the game for when things really start to go crazy. The Pope's Exorcist never really developed its characters. And honestly, for the first 2/3 of the movie, made you wonder who it was really about. And it throws us into this dumb action, like I said, twisting heads. I think there's vomiting going on, upside down crosses. If you've seen it in The Exorcist, you've seen it in this, where ultimately they just sort of try to tell you subtlety is wildly overrated. And you kind of have to ask yourself, does this movie represent what normal, everyday people would do in a bizarre situation? Does it seem realistic, I guess, given the circumstances, right? Because, it's demonic possession is not exactly something you're going to see throughout, your day. You're not, I just saw this guy possessed by a demon. That doesn't really happen, right? So given the circumstances, does this seem realistic? Is this something that you could actually see these characters doing and responding to in a way that you'd be like, well, yeah, I guess I could see that happening, right? If yes, then okay, maybe it's at least a component of what would make a movie good. If not, the movie's probably not going to be all that great. Or if it is good, it's good in a way that is just stupid and fun, kind of, maybe a parody of things, like horror comedy, so to speak. There's a great horror comedy movie, by the way, called The Killer Couch. Highly recommend it. It's hilarious. So back to the economics here, right? I went through what makes a movie good, what makes a movie not good. How does this apply in economics? Well, instead of thinking about it as a movie, think about it more as like a model, right? Or a modeling process. Does the model make good, realistic assumptions? Do the optimizing agents in the model, do the households, do the firms, the governments, the monetary authorities, do they have objectives that make sense? Are they doing things that would be consistent with what your intuition would tell you they're supposed to be doing, right? Does a household want to maximize its utility subject to a budget constraint? Are they going to be spending their money on things that make sense? Once we understand what their objectives are and we achieve an equilibrium, does the equilibrium make sense? Or if we have multiple equilibria, do they make sense? Then does the model generate data that would be considered realistic? Okay, so we have optimizing agents that have objectives that make sense. Maybe the equilibrium makes sense, but then when you try to generate data, does the data actually generate something that also makes sense, right? So all kind of wrapped up, we have to ask ourselves: does the model accurately represent reality in order to answer a good economic question? If we answer yes to these, then it has a chance of being a good model, and if we answer no, then well, probably not. Now, a lot of economic studies will work this way. They optimize, they find an equilibrium, and then they test the results against real-world data. Most models, or really most papers, I should say, are one or the other. It's either going to be a theoretical paper or an empirical paper. Now, the theoretical, it's really the first two stages of economics that we discussed, right? There's the optimization and the equilibrium. That's the theoretical component. That's where you're like, I wonder what would happen if, how can we develop a model that answers the question of, let's say, how monetary policy is going to be affecting the real economy. And, if you don't really know what that means just yet, don't worry, you'll learn in a couple of weeks. But you would go, okay, well, I've got a household, I've got some firms, I've got a government, and I have, say, the Federal Reserve, right? And you come up with like theoretical specifications for how these guys should operate, put them all together, let them all kind of operate together, and then see what the outcome is, right? That's the theoretical component. The empirical component is where we then go, all right, let's go get some data. Let's get data for prices in the United States. Let's get data for output in the United States. We need interest rates. We need, a money supply. And then maybe we would need something like, like a stock market or something like that. And we can kind of see how these variables would all sort of interact with each other in the event that monetary policy is something similar to what this question is that we had. Now, you can sometimes get a paper that's both, but that's really not very common. However, in this class, we will be learning both because we need both theory and empirical evidence. One without the other is just garbage, it's complete trash. So, with that all said, we're going to get ready to wrap up this lecture. So, let's talk about what we're going to learn and when we're going to learn it in this course. Well, first, we're going to learn about the basics of macroeconomics. So, we're going to learn about gross domestic product, inflation, and unemployment. And then from there, we're going to look at the two different subsets of macroeconomics. And it's really got to do with the time frame that we're looking at, because all of macroeconomics is time dependent. So it's like, what was GDP, or what was the country's output last year versus what it is this year, right? So we're looking at how things evolve over time. Now, when we're looking at the really slow moving stuff, that tends to be economic growth and development. And when it comes to economic growth and development, it's questions of, how do we define growth? What is it? What causes growth? Why are some countries richer than others? And if we understand why some countries might be richer than others, what can we do to encourage growth in the countries that aren't as rich? Those questions really fall under the growth and development, which is a very slow-moving, very long-run time frame that we're going to be looking at. And once we understand these very slow-moving, long-run dynamics, we can then sort of up that frequency a little bit to the business cycle frequency. So instead of looking at things at like an annual or 5 or a 10-year frequency, we can go to something that's more like a quarterly or maybe even a monthly frequency. And when we get there, that's where we'll be talking about things like recessions. We'll talk about fiscal and monetary policy, and then the different types of models that explain these policy interventions and their relationships to the real economy. And these will really be the three main sections of the course. So with that being said, that wraps up this lecture. I know I kind of suck at ending lectures. I'll try to get better at that throughout the semester, but I've been teaching now for like 5 years, and my outros have just never really been any good. So we can hope they get better, but I'm not holding my breath anytime soon. So thank you for watching this, and the next lecture will be coming out next week, and we'll be learning about gross domestic product. So thanks for watching. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you next week.